Lifelines give a knitter a place to safely rip back to so as not to have to redo the whole project in case of an error of some sort. That could be anything from the yarn breaking to you making a mistake to realizing that you had done everything beautiful but forgot a cable cross. Any number of things can happen. I find it easiest to leave some weight on the knitting while inserting the lifeline, but here I am straightening my weight. It wasn't well centered, and that will cause trouble rather than helping me, so centering it first. Now I have a contrasting piece of yarn of similar weight to the main yarn in a yarn needle, and we just take it through each stitch in order. I prefer to work all of them going in from the front. That way it will be predictable what I need to pick up and hang if I need to rehang these stitches, and it will be easier to pull the lifeline out once I'm done with it than it would be if I had positioned its entry into the stitches randomly. When done, you can just leave the remainder of the yarn and the yarn needle hanging. I like to knit the first row after the lifeline back from hold, just because those stitches have been somewhat filled up with the needle full of yarn, with the extra strand of yarn actually, and it will knit more smoothly back from hold. Here's a slow, close look at the process. One good use of the lifeline is to work a neckband. Suppose the stockinette knitting below the lifeline is the body of a sweater, and above that I want to knit the ribbing, and that's what I'm in the process of doing right now. I'm going to drop every third stitch, ladder it down, reform it as a purl stitch. The stitch can't run past the lifeline, so that gives me an easy place to insert my tool and start latching up. It also helps if I make a mistake. Here I did it on purpose, but very often we accidentally drop the wrong stitch. Both of the dropped stitches in this case are held on the lifeline, so I can go ahead and correct one, letting the other just sit there, make the wrongly dropped stitch back into a knit stitch, then purl the column that I initially intended to purl. It just saved me from myself. Should you realize that there's a mistake a few rows back, you can rip back to the lifeline, start again from there, and correct the mistake. It could be your mistake. It could be that a stitch accidentally tucked because you have a needle wearing out and didn't realize it. It could be that the yarn had a knot that knitted through and you don't want that. You want to go back and remove that knot. And a bonus, although the purl stitches don't pop off when unknitting, and by the way, I have a whole video on ripping rows, they don't pop off and resettle in the same manner that knit stitches do. But because we have our lifeline, it's okay to drop them and let them run and rehang at the lifeline. Cables are a time when a lot of knitters like to use lifelines. The reason being they're a good bit of work, much more than many machine knits, and it's very easy to lose track of the correct row upon which to make your cable crosses. And in addition to that, sometimes when you cross the cable, you're positive all the stitches are resettled. They are not, and you have a dropped stitch. Nobody wants to re-knit 200 rows out of the 240 that are needed and all that cabling if they can save the project. In this case, I'm working a 3 stitches over 3 stitches cable, and left and right of the cable, laddering down a column of stitches and reforming it as purls. That will set off the cable. It will be more visible on the knit side of the fabric. This is a classic operation, and another advantage that we are taking of this lifeline is that I did not start this cable right at the imaginary hem of the imaginary garment. It started partway up. The lifeline appearing in the previous row gives me a place to ladder down my purl stitches to without fear of losing count or altogether losing them. If you were to insert the lifeline on the same row where the cable crosses were made, and you needed to go back to that point to rip down to it, it wouldn't be all that much help. It would still be confusing as well as difficult to hang the stitches. So what I like to do is make a note of this fact, knit one row after the crossing row, and that's the row to put the lifeline into. In this case, I borrowed the lifeline from below and I'm reinserting it above because I'm just demonstrating. In real life, it would probably be smart to leave them both in place throughout the project. Generally, cable instructions are to cross the cables every 4, 6, 8 rows, something like that. So you need to be very clear with yourself that the lifeline takes place on row 1 after knitting row 1 rather than after knitting the final row of the repeat. Generally, cable instructions are to cross the cables every 4, 6, 8 rows, something like that. So you need to be very clear with yourself that the lifeline takes place on row 1 after knitting row 1 rather than after knitting the final row of the repeat. If you didn't keep track accurately, you might knit the next repeat wrong and have to go back to your lifeline again. Another reason to use a lifeline is just before knitting darts, if you're knitting them into a bodice front on a sweater. Really, it's not necessary for this purpose if you are an experienced knitter, but new knitters tend to find darts confusing, lose count, make mistakes, or they're just plain nervous about it. So there's no need to be nervous if you put in a lifeline just before the dart sequence. That way, if you somehow do mess up the darts, you can back down to just below them and do them again. I have just knitted an imaginary bodice front with a dart that placed 6 needles in hold on each side. Suppose after knitting it, I just discovered, oh, it should have ended up 8 rows on each side. I did it wrong, and I want to back out of the 6 stitch darts and correct them. I can do that. If this actually happens to you, the ripping process is covered in more detail in the ripping video because darts do come off the machine in a little bit different way, just slightly, than regular straight across the bed knitting does. Probably the most famous and popular reason to use a lifeline is this one. I did not have the yarn correctly seated in the feeder, but I did not notice, and all my work fell off the machine. Lifeline to the rescue. Just unravel all the knitting right down to the lifeline and proceed to rehang the stitches. Remember, the knitting forms on the machine with the purl side within your sight. That's what you're looking at. Hang it back in the same manner unless you purposely want to change sides. Some people have trouble with the stitches that are on the lifeline still being there but getting smaller. You can do what you just saw me do. Use both ends of the lifeline around the stitch to help it grow back so you can find it to hang properly, or you can try this other trick. Transfer the stitches from your lifeline onto a circular knitting needle meant for hand knitting. The very cheapest ones will do fine. You can order eBay ones and be perfectly happy with this. The advantage is that the point of the needle and the part you would hold to knit can be selected to be the size you want the stitch to be, so it holds the stitches open. And even the cable portion, particularly on cheaper needles, so that's a good thing about the cheap needles, tends to be considerably thicker than your yarn, so it keeps the stitches plumped out. Then you can rehang the stitches from your circular needle by pulling each one to the tip and transferring it directly to the machine. Make sure not to twist the stitches while you're hanging. You may find it useful to periodically hang claw weights to keep the knitting pulled down while you work so it doesn't try to pop off the needles, and or Bring the needles forward to hold after a batch holds stitches, which also prevents the jumping off tendency. My stitches are all restored to their position. Remember to add a little bit of weight if it's suitable to your machine. Most times, right after rehanging it is, and they'll knit just fine.